Hey everyone, it's 4 o'clock in New York. Donald Trump started the day lost in Seinfeld's The Opposite episode, tweeting that because of him, we're not at war with North Korea. Really. Here it is, quote, many good conversations with North Korea. It is going well. In the meantime, no rocket launches or nuclear testing in 8 months. All of Asia is thrilled. Only the opposition party, which includes the fake news, is complaining. If not for me, we would be at war with North Korea. But it's actually Donald Trump's own intelligence agencies who have determined that North Korea has increased nuclear production at secret sites. That reporting is based on interviews with more than a dozen U.S. officials. But Donald Trump didn't stop his attack on American intelligence agencies there. This morning, he also carved out time to attack the NSA, led by Mr. Trump's own appointee, Admiral Mike Rogers. He tweeted, quote, wow. The NSA has deleted 685 million phone calls and text messages. Privacy violations? They blame technical irregularities. Such a disgrace. The witch hunt continues. If you're keeping track at home, that's 2 more new breaks between the president and his own intelligence agencies. He may also find himself at odds with the bipartisan assessment of the Senate Intel Committee. In the last hour, they released their report on the intelligence community assessment that Russia interfered in the 2016 election in order to help Trump and hurt Clinton. Do you get that? They agreed that the intelligence community assessment to help Trump and hurt Clinton is true. Writing the conclusions of the assessment are sound. Here to discuss the day's surreal developments, some of our favorite reporters and friends. Joining us from the White House, NBC's Hans Nichols, Matt Miller, former chief spokesman for the Justice Department and an MSNBC analyst, Malcolm Nance, MSNBC analyst and author of the new book, The Plot to Destroy Democracy, How Putin and his Spies Are Undermining America and Dismantling the West. And with us at the table, Jason Johnson, politics editor for The Root, and Jonathan Capehart, Washington Post opinion writer. Both are MSNBC contributors. I have to start with you, Malcolm, and let me read you this list. Who says Russia meddled to help Trump? The CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the DNI, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, House Democrats, and Trey Gowdy. Who doubts that Russia meddled to help Trump? President Trump, Devin Nunes, and Vladimir Putin. Did I miss anybody?
No, you didn't miss anybody. And as a matter of fact, you know, you could pretty much just throw in there everybody that voted for Trump, because whatever he says goes, and whatever Vladimir Putin says goes for Donald Trump. You know, this is very disturbing, especially that comment about NSA a little bit earlier. First off, 6 million phone calls and emails is about 10 seconds of collection of at NSA, so that's not very significant. But it just goes to show they are declaring war on anything credible in America. And it will undermine us. It will damage our national security. And mark my words, at some point, it will kill someone.
It's a chilling thought. Matt Miller, let me bring you in on this. I mean, I feel like we started having this conversation before Donald Trump was sworn in. Pre-inauguration, he was at war with the intelligence community over the same issues. And I know General Hayden and people who have worked for Democrats and Republicans have called this an all-out assault on the truth, an assault on evidence-based sciences, on journalism, on intelligence collection, on law enforcement, on the rule of law. Where do you put today's audacious tweets, and we shouldn't become numb to them, in any other climate? The things the president tweeted today would be 2 brush fires, 2 scandals in and of themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think to understand the president's tweet, the president's attacks on the intelligence community, you have to take them in the context of his tweets on independent journalism, on the FBI, on law enforcement, on anyone that can be an independent arbiter of the truth, because he has to create this alternative reality where what he says is true and what everyone else says is not, even if it's backed up by evidence, even if it's the unanimous conclusion of the intelligence committee or anyone else that disagrees with him. And so when you see the president attack like this, first you have this bizarre thing where his attack on the NSA, and it's like someone who's, he's the president of the United States, has access to the most sensitive intelligence information in the country, and he's getting his information about what the NSA does by watching Fox News. It is an absurd thing and obviously somewhat dangerous. But then, ultimately you have the effect of his attacks, which are, number one, overseas. You'll see our adversaries use, what the president says against us overseas. Vladimir Putin's interference with elections doesn't just happen here, it happens in Europe. And when you see Trump cast doubt on it, you will see Vladimir Putin turn around and use that to his advantage all across the world. Second, at home, there is going to come a time when the president is going to need the assessments of the intelligence community. And if he has done so much to sow distrust with the American public about whether they're telling the truth, they're not going to believe what the intelligence community says at a time this country really needs them.
Hans Nichols, I haven't seen any official response out of the White House yet to this brand new report from the Senate Intel Committee, but the president has cherry-picked in the past what he likes and doesn't like from the intelligence committees, and he always comes down on the side of the one on the other side of the Capitol, the House Intel Committee, where his good buddies are over there running roughshod over the Justice Department and the FBI. Any sense of how they might respond or whether they'll respond to this at all?
No indication of that yet, Nicolle. I think you're right to point out that the president is generally predisposed to these reports that tend to exonerate them, and he's very dismissive of the ones that call into question his statements and his core belief that this is one giant hoax. And yet, as you said in your intro, we have another example of an independent, in this case, bipartisan committee saying that Russia was clearly behind and meddled in the elections. We just saw Ambassador Bolton when he was in Moscow. He said he raised this issue with Putin, and they seem to be inclined, the Trump administration, to believe Mr. Putin's denials. We'll see how that plays out, not just at this NATO summit, where the topic of Russia is going to be front and center and just what their intent is, but more importantly, when President Trump meets with President Putin, when they get together in Helsinki right after the NATO summit. I think it's going to make it very awkward for President Trump and perhaps put pressure on him to raise it yet again with Mr. Putin. But we know what Trump's response is likely to be.
I want to ask you, Hans, because you're doing double duty for us today there at the White House, but you also cover the Pentagon. What do you think Secretary Mattis thinks when he hears that Donald Trump believes that if not for Donald Trump, we would be at war with North Korea? Do you think that's the Pentagon's assessment of the relationship?
Yeah, I think, especially on North Korea, Mattis has been very reluctant to involve himself. And I think Mattis's goal, and this might not be the answer you're looking for, but Mattis's goal is just stay out of the line of fire, keep the pressure on to let the diplomats, as he says every time we ask him about this, let the diplomats do his work. I think where Trump complicates things a little bit more for Mattis is on NATO. Because when Trump browbeats NATO officials and says, you need to spend more, you need to spend more, a couple days later, Mattis will be having conversations similar to that, saying, could you please help us in Afghanistan? Can you help stand up a training mission in Iraq? And when you look at the argument that Trump is making, it's actually not controversial that NATO countries need to spend more. You can go back to the 90s and find debates on this on Capitol Hill, that countries inside NATO need to spend more. The issue really is why they need to spend more. And the argument from Mattis is always, you need to spend more because you don't know what Russia is up to. A great power competition. You hear that all the time inside the Pentagon. NATO countries need to spend more because of the threat from Russia. That's not exactly what we hear from President Donald Trump.
And Jason, Hans brought us there. Let me put it up for our viewers. The New York Times reporting, Trump warns NATO allies to spend more on defense or else. President Trump has written sharply worded letters to the leaders of several NATO allies, including Germany, Belgium, Norway, and Canada, taking them to task for spending too little on their own defense and warning that the United States is losing patience with what he said was their failure to meet security obligations shared by the alliance. And as Hans said, there's nothing wrong with encouraging them to spend more, but diplomacy is usually about talking to your friends in private and harassing your adversaries in public. Donald Trump has it completely inverted. He harasses our friends in public and cozies up to our adversaries privately without I mean, he met with Kim Jong-un without a staffer. He has met with Vladimir Putin without an American translator. So he seems to have this, you know, again, sticking with the opposite frame, he seems to have this backward.
It's that old sorts analogy of, you know, keep it in the locker room. Like he's constantly airing everybody's dirty laundry on Front Street. And this is why this is significant. We're about to go into a NATO conference where no one's going to want to talk to him. Because do any of our NATO allies believe that Trump isn't going to take any secret information they share and run straight to his best friend Putin a week and a half later? That's what we're facing here. The president just doesn't have an attack on our intelligence community. He has an attack sort of on American intelligence. Like he wants to create this sort of Fahrenheit 451 newspeak where whatever he says happens to be reality. And unfortunately, that makes it dangerous for any of our allies to share information with him about what could be a threat to America, because he's more interested in appeasing Russia and appeasing North Korea than he is in keeping the United States and our allies safe.
It struck me, Jonathan, when I saw this report released in the last hour from the Senate Intel Committee, chaired by Republican Richard Burr and by Senator Mark Warner, that maybe Burr fought to release it it at 3:30 on the Tuesday before the 4th of July, hoping that the president would be on a golf course somewhere and that no one at Fox would have time to process it and attack them for coming down as, you know, fuddy-duddies and not taking the Hannity line on Russian meddling.
Or just trying to hide completely in plain sight, hoping that Fox News doesn't do anything with it at all. Look, what we're watching here, and just everything that we've been talking about, is the President of the United States sort of dismantling America at home, while at the same time dismantling the Western alliance that the United States spent 70 years putting together and maintaining. This NATO summit, to jump off what Jason was just talking about, is extremely dangerous. The fact that the President of the United States is basically, it seems, willing to give Russia just a pass on annexing Crimea, if you are the Baltic states, if you're Poland, if that happens in Helsinki, if there are any signs whatsoever that the President of the United States is just going to let Vladimir Putin stay there, then those countries should be scared to death, because then the United States treaty obligations under NATO to come to the defense of the NATO alliance is now would then legitimately be thrown into question. And there was even a year ago, my saying this would be, oh, you're being hyperbolic, you're just being super crazy. We're a couple of weeks away from finding out whether or not that is indeed the reality.
Yeah, and Malcolm, let me ask you, first of all, if you accept Jonathan Capehart's thesis there, I mean, Russia's doing pretty well. I guess I've asked this question this week, but I haven't had you. What is left on Vladimir Putin's honey-do list that Trump hasn't done? I mean, I think that's the better question, right? I think we are all too timid. We are afraid of being accused of hyperbole. But what hasn't Trump done that Vladimir Putin would have wanted him to do?
Well, the only thing that's left to do on the wish list is lift sanctions against Russia and just give carte blanche to believe that Crimea is
But he tried. I mean, the Senate passed them. I mean, that's not even really on. I mean, just to take up in Donald Trump's defense, which I don't think has ever happened in this hour, he tried. Sure. He tried. And Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Senate stopped him. But we know he wanted to.
I think he will arbitrarily, straight across the board, in defiance of law, at the end of the Putin-Trump summit, will declare Russia good boys and will say, we need to lift the sanctions. I really think he's in their pocket, you know? I mean, going after NATO is just utterly amazing because, as you know, NATO's not just paying with their money. They are paying in blood, defending alongside of the United States like they did in Afghanistan. Donald Trump doesn't get that. In his mind, Russia is his base, a critical part of his base, and he's going to pay them off one way or another.
Matt Miller, let me ask you what Robert Mueller thinks about the crafting of such flagrantly pro-Putin foreign policy. Do you think he would want to talk to the men and women who helped shape U.S. foreign policy in a way that's favorable to Vladimir Putin? I mean, do you think that's a line of the investigation at all? We know that some of his national security officials have been into meet with Mueller's team, but do you think that is something they want to understand, how foreign policy is crafted, how something like, I'm glad I fired Comey, it got the pressure off me, how a U.S. president says that to two top Russian officials? Do you think that's of interest to Robert Mueller?
It's a very difficult call because obviously he is the president of the United States. He does have the authority and the responsibility to conduct U.S. foreign policy. But if you go back to the central question that Bob Mueller is looking at, it's whether the president, was involved in the Russians, attempts to interfere with the election, and really whether he was doing it, whether he promised them something in exchange. And so, of course, if you look at a quid pro quo, the quo side of that would be him delivering for them once he got into the White House. So we do know there are parts of that Mueller is looking at. For example, if you go back during the campaign, the successful effort by Paul Manafort and others on the Trump campaign to change the Republican platform. Obviously, the meeting in the Oval Office where Trump said to the Russian foreign minister and the Russian ambassador that he was, firing Comey had taken pressure off of him, which would make it easier for him to conduct foreign policy in a way that's favorable to Russia. That goes very much to his motivations and whether he did, conduct some or enter into some kind of corrupt arrangement with the Russians during the campaign. So I think there are portions of it that probably stray outside what is in his mandate. But when it goes to that core question of whether there is an arrangement, I think yes, it's very much something he'll be looking at.
Hans, let me ask you if you're picking up anything from either of the buildings that you cover about this, what seems like a stray dog of a tweet this morning about the NSA. I accept the theory that he saw something in Fox News that angered him, but the NSA is a serious and really vital agency in terms of battling terrorism and thwarting plots against the United States of America and tracking people that are already known to be a risk to Americans here and abroad. Right. I mean, the idea that he just wakes up and attacks his own NSA is stunning. And I wonder if anyone said a word about that. I find it harder and harder to get folks to engage about the president's Twitter feed at that White House.
You know, I make calls to the Pentagon today, and especially on sensitive conversations like this, people are very reluctant to talk on the phone, in part because the NSA has the ability to listen to phone calls, and there is a culture of clamping down on leaks throughout the administration. So the only thing I have to report to you is that I didn't get anyone to really talk over the phone about this subject. It did strike me is that the president was trying to give himself immunization, and it seemed like he was giving himself a bit of a shot, and we're kind of wondering what might happen next. You know, one quick thing back on the Putin discussion, when President Trump sits down with President Putin will be in a position of strength in part because of the price of oil. You look at the strength of the Russian economy when oil is at $75 a barrel. That is a much different situation it was than when Trump started his administration. And yes, the Europeans, there's some divisions there on whether or not they should lift sanctions. That's why Merkel's government is so crucial on whether or not she's going to stay in power, because if Merkel's government collapses, you could see the sanctions regime against Russia fading away rather quickly, especially with the new government in Italy. This summit, these back-to-back summit, NATO and then Helsinki, are really going to be crucial, not just for the next coming months, but for the coming years.
All right, Hans Nichols, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Malcolm Nance, thank you as well. When we come back, fresh reporting on Michael.